I never thought marriage would take my son so far from me. Not suddenly, not loudly, but slowly. So quietly that by the time I felt the distance, it had already settled deep between us. Even now, as I sit alone by the window in the late evening, watching the soft light stretch across the floor, those words feel heavy inside my chest. They do not come from anger. They do not come from bitterness. They come from a quiet ache, the kind that grows slowly without announcing itself. This is not a story about shouting. It is not about harsh words or broken homes. It is a story about silence, about space, about how love can remain, but closeness can quietly disappear. My name does not matter much. What matters is that I am a mother. And my son's name is Saad. For most of my life, Saad was the center of everything, not because I wanted it that way, but because life shaped us like that. His father passed away when Saad was still young, and from that moment on, we became a small world of two people holding each other upright. I still remember the sound of Saad's footsteps when he was little. He never walked softly. He ran through the house as if the floor belonged to him. Every sound he made filled the rooms with life. "Mom," he would call from the doorway. "Mom, are you there? Mom, look at this." He always called me first. Always. Back then, I believed that bond was something unbreakable. I believed love like ours did not fade. I believed that even when he married, even when his life grew bigger, there would still be room for me. I did not know that love can remain, but priority can change. The first time I felt something shift, it did not hurt. Not it felt like a small breeze passing through an open window, noticeable but easy to ignore. Saad had married Sanaa only a few months earlier. She was polite, well-spoken, and careful with her words. She never raised her voice. She never disrespected me directly. And yet, something felt different. One evening, I stood in the kitchen, stirring a simple pot of lentils. The house was quieter than usual. Too quiet. Saad and Sanaa were in their room. The door was closed. It should not have bothered me. They were newly married. They deserved privacy. I told myself that again and again. But my heart noticed what my mind tried to dismiss. Earlier, Saad would sit with me after dinner. We would talk about nothing important. Work. Weather. Small memories. That evening, dinner passed quietly. Sanaa ate quickly and smiled politely. Saad checked his phone. Then they both stood up. "We're tired, Mom," Saad said gently. "We'll talk later." Later. That word sounded harmless. But it stayed with me long after they closed the door. I sat alone at the dining table, listening to the clock tick. The food grew cold, the silence grew loud. I remember thinking, maybe I am imagining things. Mothers are good at that. We explain pain away before it can settle. Days passed. Then weeks. The house was still full, but something important was missing. Saad spoke less, he listened less. When I asked him about his day, his answers became shorter. "Fine, Mom. Busy. Everything's okay." Sanaa remained polite. Always polite. But politeness is not warmth. Sometimes when I entered a room, conversations would stop, not abruptly. Just gently, as if I had arrived a moment too early. I began to hesitate before speaking. Before asking questions. Before offering advice. I told myself I was being respectful. But deep inside I knew I was becoming careful. One afternoon, I overheard Sanaa speaking softly to Saad. "She worries too much," Sanaa said. "We need our space." Her voice was calm. Not angry. Not cruel. But those words settled inside me like dust. Quietly but everywhere. That night I could not sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the slow rhythm of the house. I wondered when my presence had started to feel like interference. I remembered Saad as a child, clinging to my dupatta, afraid to sleep alone. I remembered how he would refuse to eat unless I sat beside him. I remembered how he once told me, "Mom, when I grow up, I'll never leave you." He did not lie. He simply grew. And growing, I learned, sometimes means moving away. The first time Saad corrected me in front of Sanaa, it hurt more than I expected. "Mom, it's fine," he said lightly. "Sanaa does things differently." Differently. The word was gentle. but it placed a line between what I was and what I was no longer meant to be. I smiled, that I nodded, that I stepped back. That became my new habit. Stepping back. I stopped entering their room without asking. Then I stopped knocking altogether. I stopped offering suggestions. Then I stopped asking questions. I told myself I was adjusting. But what I was really doing was disappearing quietly. One evening I sat by the window, watching the sun lower itself behind the buildings. The sky was soft with color. Saad passed behind me without stopping. "Mom," he said casually, "we might move out soon." The words landed gently, but they shook something deep inside me. "Of course," I replied. "You should." I smiled again. He smiled back, relieved. That was the moment I understood something important. Love does not disappear when children grow up. But space expands. And sometimes that space becomes distance. That night, I whispered something to myself that I had never thought I would say. I am no longer the center of his world. And somehow, that truth hurt more than I was ready for. I did not know yet how far that distance would stretch. I did not know that this was only the beginning. All I knew was that something precious was slipping away quietly. Not stolen. Not broken. Just slowly. Gently being pushed aside. And I was learning, one quiet evening at a time, how it feels to love someone who no longer needs you the way they once did. There are moments in life when nothing dramatic happens, yet everything changes. No doors slam, no voices rise, no harsh words are spoken. Only a feeling settles quietly, like dust on furniture you no longer use. That is how it happened with my son. I began to notice the pauses before he answered me. The way his eyes drifted away when I spoke for too long. The way his phone seemed more important than my stories. Small things, so small that I felt foolish even noticing them. One morning I made breakfast early, the way I always had, that I laid the table carefully. I waited. Saad walked past the kitchen. "We already ate," he said gently. "Sana made something." I nodded. I smiled. But after he left, I stood there for a long moment, staring at the untouched plates. Food can be reheated, but moments, once missed, they do not return the same way. I told myself it was normal. I told myself I should be happy that my son had found a wife who cared for him. And I was happy, truly. But happiness can exist beside sadness. People rarely talk about that. As days passed, I noticed how carefully Sana arranged her life around Saad. Their meals, their outings, their plans, and how carefully Saad adjusted himself around her. That is what marriage does. It reshapes people. But no one tells mothers how quietly they are reshaped too. I began to feel like a guest in my own home, not unwelcome, just unnecessary. Sometimes I would start speaking, and then stop halfway through my sentence. Because Saad looked distracted. Because Sana looked uncomfortable. Because silence felt safer than being misunderstood. I learned to listen more than I spoke. To observe rather than participate. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, I would sit on my bed and think about the woman I used to be. The mother who knew every detail of her son's life. The mother whose advice mattered. The mother whose presence was enough. Now, I was learning how to be invisible without making noise. One evening, Saad sat beside me on the sofa. For a moment, my heart lifted. "Mom," he said softly, "you don't have to worry so much anymore." I smiled again. That smile had become my shield. "I know," I replied. But what he meant was not what I heard. He meant I was no longer needed the same way. I heard that I was slowly being replaced. Neither of us said the real words out loud. We didn't need to. Love does not always end with goodbye. Sometimes, it ends with adjustment. And adjustment, when you are a mother, can feel like loss. I wondered if other mothers felt this too, if they sat by their windows in the evening, replaying small moments, if they questioned themselves, if they blamed their own hearts for holding on too tightly. No one teaches a mother how to let go gently. We are only taught how to hold. And so, I kept holding, quietly, carefully, even as my son stepped further into a life that no longer revolved around me. I did not know yet that this distance would grow, that silence would deepen, that one day, words would be spoken that could never be taken back. For now, all I knew was this. After my son married, I was not pushed out all at once. I was pushed out slowly. One quiet moment at a time. Before I speak about distance, I need to speak about love. Because you cannot understand what was lost unless you understand what once existed. Saad was not just my son. He was my world. His father passed away when Saad was still young, leaving behind a silence that filled every corner of our home. From that day onward, I became everything for my child. Mother, guide, protector, and sometimes, the only voice of comfort he had. We grew up together in many ways. Every morning, I would wake up before sunrise. I would prepare his breakfast, iron his clothes, and pack his school bag. I never rushed these moments. They were small, but they mattered to me. Saad used to sit on the edge of the bed while tying his shoes, talking about his dreams. Sometimes it was about school. Sometimes about friends. Sometimes about nothing at all. But he always talked, and I always listened. When he was sick, I stayed awake through the night, pressing my hand to his forehead, whispering prayers I learned from my own mother. When he was scared, he slept beside me, holding my hand until his breathing softened. I never thought of it as sacrifice. It was simply motherhood. As Saad grew older, life became busier, but our bond remained steady. He learned responsibility early. He respected me deeply. Even as a young man, he would ask my opinion before making decisions. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. That was the Saad I raised. When he told me about Sana, I remember the softness in his voice. He spoke about her carefully, as if he was afraid to disturb something delicate. "She's kind, Mom," he said. "She understands me." I listened quietly, watching his eyes light up in a way I had not seen before. I did not feel threatened. I felt relieved. A mother wants her child to find peace, and I believed Sana would bring that into his life. The first time I met her, she greeted me respectfully. She was polite, well-mannered, and gentle in her speech. She never crossed a line. I welcomed her with an open heart. I imagined a future where we would sit together in the kitchen, sharing recipes and stories. Where she would call me when she needed advice. Where I would gain a daughter, not lose a son. The wedding was beautiful. I watched Saad stand beside Sana, proud and happy. I told myself this was the beginning of something new, not the end of something old. After marriage, they lived with me for a while. Tea first, everything felt normal. We ate together. We laughed. We adjusted. Sana was quiet but respectful. Saad was attentive to both of us. I believed we were finding our balance. But balance is delicate, and sometimes it shifts without warning. Slowly, routines changed. Meals were no longer shared every day. Conversations became shorter. Sana began spending more time in their room. Saad, too, became busier. I did not complain. I did not question. I told myself this was part of married life. But inside me, something felt unfamiliar. I noticed how careful Sana was with her words. How she chose silence instead of openness. How she smiled without warmth. I noticed how Saad listened to her more closely than he listened to me. That should not have hurt, but it did. Not because I wanted to be chosen over her, but because I felt myself slowly being left behind. One afternoon, Sana reorganized the kitchen. She did not ask me first. She did not mean harm. But when I reached for a familiar shelf and found everything changed, I felt something tighten inside my chest. That kitchen had been my space for decades. Now, it felt unfamiliar. I smiled and said nothing. Smiling had become easier than explaining. I began spending more time alone. I read, I prayed, I sat by the window. Sometimes, Saad would pass by and ask, "Are you okay, Mom?" Yes, I would reply, always yes. But the truth was, I was learning how to step back without falling apart. I missed the way he used to seek me out. I missed being needed. But I reminded myself that children are not meant to stay the same. They grow, they change. And mothers learn to adjust. I did not know yet that adjustment would slowly turn into distance, that silence would grow heavier, that understanding would be replaced by misunderstanding. For now, I held on to hope. Hope that this was temporary. Hope that love would find its way back into the spaces that felt empty. I did not realize that this setup, these small, quiet changes, were preparing me for a deeper hurt. A hurt that would not come with shouting or blame, but with something far more painful. Being forgotten. The distance did not arrive all at once. It came quietly, disguised as routine-des normal life-des adjustment. At first, I blamed myself for noticing it. I told myself that I was overthinking, that I was holding on to the past too tightly, that I needed to give my son space to build his own life. But the heart notices things long before the mind accepts them. I began to feel it in small moments. Moments that were easy to ignore but hard to forget. One morning, I stood in the hallway holding a letter that had arrived for Saad. I waited for him to come out of his room. When he did, he barely glanced at me. "Just leave it on the table, Mom," he said. "I'll see it later." Later. That word again. I placed the letter down and stepped back, feeling oddly foolish for waiting. I had waited for him my entire life. Why did it feel different now? Another day, I asked him if he would join me for tea in the evening. "Sana has plans," he replied gently. "We'll sit another day." Another day. That day did not come. Slowly I stopped asking. I began to notice how conversations changed tone when Sana was around. If I spoke too long, Saad's eyes would shift toward her. If I laughed too loudly, Sana's smile would tighten. No one told me to be quiet. But I learned to lower my voice anyway. No one told me to stay away. But I learned to keep my distance. Sometimes I would hear them talking behind closed doors. Not arguments, just conversations. And yet I was never invited into those conversations anymore. Once I overheard Sana say softly, "We need boundaries." The word stayed with me for days. Boundaries. I wondered when love had begun to need boundaries. I remembered a time when Saad would come home late and sit beside me without saying a word, just to feel my presence. Now, presence felt like interference. One evening, Saad returned home tired. I could see it in his face. I asked, "Long day?" "Yes," he said, and then he walked past me. I stood there, holding the rest of the sentence inside me. I was learning how to keep things unsaid. The house felt different now. Not hostile, just careful. Sana moved through the rooms confidently, arranging things, planning schedules, setting routines. She never excluded me directly. She simply didn't include me. When relatives visited, she handled everything. Saad stood beside her. I sat quietly, smiling when spoken to. Once, during a family gathering, someone asked Saad, "Who handles things at home now?" He laughed softly and said, "Sana takes care of it." The words were harmless. But they stung. Not because I wanted control, but because I felt erased. After that day, I noticed how often Sana referred to the house as ours. Never Mom's house. Never home. Just ours. I started spending more time in my room. That it felt safer there. At night I would lie awake, replaying conversations in my head, wondering if I had said too much or too little. I wondered if Sana felt uncomfortable because of me, that if my presence made her feel watched, if my love felt like pressure. I never asked her. I was afraid of the answer. One afternoon, I offered to help her with cooking. "No, Mom," she said politely. "I've got it." Her voice was gentle, but final. I stepped back again. That evening, Saad mentioned they were thinking of moving out. "Just for independence," he explained quickly. "It's normal." He nodded. I told him I understood. And I did. But understanding did not make it hurt less. As the days passed, Saad became more distant. He spoke less about his thoughts, less about his worries. I was no longer the person he turned to first. I noticed how often he sided with Sana, even in small things. If I suggested something, he would say, "Let's see what Sana thinks." That sentence built a quiet wall between us. I did not argue. I did not compete. I stepped aside. But stepping aside, I learned, can feel like stepping out of your own life. One evening I tried to talk to Saad. "Have I done something wrong?" I asked softly. He looked surprised. "No, Mom," he said quickly. "Why would you think that?" Shrug. "I just feel distant." He smiled gently and said, "You're thinking too much." Maybe I was. But feelings do not come from nothing. That night, I cried silently into my pillow, careful not to make a sound. I was not angry. I was grieving something I could not name. I was grieving closeness. Days turned into weeks. weeks into months. The house felt less like a home and more like a shared space with invisible lines. I learned where I was welcome. And where I was not. I learned when to speak. And when silence was better. The rising conflict was not loud, it was quiet, slow. It was built from pauses, glances, unspoken words, and gentle corrections. And deep inside me, a realization was forming. Slowly, painfully. My son was not pushing me away with his hands. He was doing it with his life. As the weeks passed, I began to feel like time itself was moving differently for me than it was for them. Their days were full. Their plans were busy. Their lives were expanding. Mine felt smaller. I noticed how Saad's schedule no longer included me. He left early, he returned late. Sometimes he would not return at all until night. When I asked where he had been, he would answer briefly. With Sanaa. With friends. With work. He no longer asked if I had eaten, he no longer noticed if I looked tired. Those small attentions, the ones people think do not matter, were the ones that hurt the most when they disappeared. One afternoon, I waited for Saad to come home so we could go together to visit a relative. We had talked about it the day before. But he did not come. Hours passed. When he finally returned, I asked gently. I thought we were going together. He looked confused. Oh. Sanaa wasn't feeling up to it, he said. We'll go another time. Another time. That phrase had become my quiet enemy. I went alone that day. On my way back, sitting in the rickshaw, I realized something painful. I was no longer part of the decision-making. Plans were made without me. Changes happened without explanation. I was informed, not included. At home, Sanaa greeted me politely. Her tone was respectful, but distant. I tried to speak to her once, hoping to clear the air. If I ever make you uncomfortable, I said softly, please tell me. She smiled gently. No, Mom, she replied. Everything is fine. But fine does not always mean peaceful. Sometimes it only means quiet. That evening, I overheard a conversation that stayed with me longer than I expected. Saad said, Mom doesn't need to know everything. Sanaa replied, exactly. Their voices were calm. Not secretive. Not cruel. But those words felt like a door closing, softly but firmly. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. Holding my hands together, I tried to understand where I had gone wrong. Had I loved too much? Had I expected too much? Had I failed to step back when I should have? Mothers rarely ask if their love is welcomed, we assume it is. That night I barely slept. The next morning I noticed that Sanaa had changed the dining arrangement. Seats were reassigned. Spaces shifted. It was a small thing, but it made me feel displaced. I chose a chair quietly and said nothing. Saad did not notice. Or perhaps he did, and did not know what to say. I started skipping meals with them. It was easier than feeling out of place. Ate later. Alone. Sometimes Saad would ask, did you eat? Yes, I would reply. Even if I hadn't yet. Lying felt easier than explaining. I began spending more time outside. Visiting neighbors, going for small walks, sitting in the park. Anywhere that made me feel less invisible. But even outside my thoughts followed me. I remembered the Saad who once refused to go anywhere without me. The Saad who shared everything. Now I was learning about his life in pieces. One day I found out they were planning a short trip. Not from Saad, but from a relative. You must be excited, they said. Smiled. Yes, I replied. But inside something cracked. That evening I asked Saad about it. Oh, he said casually. We didn't think it was important to mention. Important. He nodded. I was learning my new place in his life. Not at the center. Not beside him. Somewhere on the edges. I noticed how often Saad defended Sanaa, even when no defense was needed. If I spoke, he would explain her side. If I hesitated, he would reassure her. I admired his loyalty as a husband. But I mourned the loyalty he no longer showed as a son. I never wanted him to choose between us, I only wanted him to remember me. One evening during dinner I made a simple suggestion. Sana smiled politely and said, "That won't work for us." Saad nodded in agreement. No discussion, no pause. Just agreement. I felt my voice disappear in that moment. After dinner, I washed the dishes quietly. The sound of water filled the kitchen. I stared at my reflection in the sink and barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked tired, smaller, quieter. That was when I understood something deeply painful. The rising conflict was not between me and Sanad. It was not even between me and Saad. It was between who I used to be and who I was becoming. A mother who no longer knew her place. And the hardest part was this. No one was doing anything wrong. They were simply living their lives. And I was learning, slowly, painfully, how it feels to be left behind without being pushed. The turning point did not arrive with shouting. It did not come with harsh words or slammed doors. It arrived quietly, the way most life-changing moments do, without warning. It was an ordinary evening. The kind that feels forgettable until it becomes unforgettable. Rain had been falling since afternoon. The house felt heavier because of it. The walls held the sound, the air, the silence. I was sitting near the window, folding clothes that had already been folded once before. Sometimes, when the mind is full, the hands need something simple to do. Saad and Sana were in the other room. Their voices were low, steady. I was not listening, or at least I did not mean to. But when you live in the same house, some words find you even when you are not searching for them. Sana said, "We need some boundaries." Her voice was calm. Not unkind. Not angry. Saad replied, "I know." Those two words made my chest tighten. Waited. She continued, "I feel like we don't have space. Not real space." Saad was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll talk to her." That was when I stopped folding. My hands froze. I knew who she meant. I stayed where I was. I did not move. I did not breathe properly. A few minutes later, Saad walked into the room. He looked nervous. He avoided my eyes at first, then sat across from me. "Mom," he said softly. That word mom used to bring me comfort. That day it felt heavy. "Yes," I replied. He cleared his throat. "Sana and we've been talking." He nodded. "We feel that maybe," he paused. "Maybe we need a little more independence." Independence. Waited. He continued. "It would be better if you didn't involve yourself in our daily matters." I searched his face for something familiar. The boy I raised, the son who once could not sleep without my voice. But his expression was distant. Not cold, just firm. "I don't interfere," I said quietly. "I know," he replied quickly. "But sometimes, your presence makes things complicated." That sentence settled inside me slowly. Not like a knife, like a weight. "I live here," I said. My voice did not shake, though my hands did. "Yes," he replied. "But this is our life now." Not including me. He nodded. "What else could I do?" He continued, almost rehearsed. "It would be best if you didn't come into our room without asking. Or make plans for us. Or expect us to inform you of everything." Each word was gentle. Each word pushed me further away. Smiled. It was a habit, a defense. "I understand," I said. But I didn't. Not fully. He stood up after that. "Thank you for understanding," he said. And then he left the room. I sat there for a long time after he was gone. The rain continued outside. I listened to it hit the window over and over again. That was the moment I realized something painful. I had not been pushed out all at once. I had been slowly moved aside. Step by step. Conversation by conversation. Silence by silence. And now, the space between us had finally been named. Boundaries. I stood up and walked to my room. I closed the door quietly. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I replayed every memory. His first steps. His first school day. The nights I stayed awake when he was sick. I had given him space to grow. I had not expected that space to turn into distance. In the morning, I woke up with a strange calm. The kind that comes after something breaks. At breakfast, I did not sit at the table. I stayed in my room. No one asked why. And that silence told me everything I needed to know. Days passed after that conversation. The house felt quieter, smaller, as if every wall, every corner, had learned to hold its breath when I walked through. I tried to tell myself it was all in my mind, that I was imagining distance where none truly existed. But feelings do not lie. One evening I decided to visit their home without warning. Just to see my son, to catch a glimpse of the boy I had raised. Now grown, I thought, maybe he would welcome me with a smile, maybe he would hug me and reassure me that nothing had changed. I walked up the familiar steps, holding my shawl tight around my shoulders. The rain from earlier had left the air thick and cool. I knocked lightly. Sod opened the door. He looked at me, paused, and then stepped back. "Mom, please. Don't come unannounced." The words were calm, gentle. And yet, they hit me harder than any argument ever could. I stood frozen. That I wanted to speak, to tell him that I had only come because I missed him, that my heart ached in ways no one could understand, but the words would not come. Behind him, Sana watched silently, her arms crossed. There was no anger, only the quiet firmness of someone who wanted the point understood. Saad didn't invite me in. He didn't ask if I was okay. He simply looked at me with tired eyes and closed the distance between us with polite but firm finality. I smiled softly, a habit I had when life hurt too much to cry. I handed him a small gift I had carried, a handmade scarf for the coming winter. "Just for you," I whispered. He took it without looking at me and said, "Thanks, Mom. I'll see you later." Later. That word again. The word that had come to define our new relationship. I walked away slowly, step by step, each one heavier than the last. The rain left wet marks on the ground, mirroring the ache in my chest. On my way home, I realized the truth. The turning point wasn't a single it wasn't a fight or a harsh word. It was the accumulation of 1,000 little moments, a gentle closing of doors, a polite insistence on space, a soft but firm redrawing of boundaries. And now my son had named the space. Now I understood it fully. I was being pushed out, not by force, not by cruelty, but by love that had been redirected, by a life that had grown without me at the center. That night I sat by my window. The streetlights cast a soft glow on the quiet street. I thought about the years we had shared. The nights I stayed awake with him. The days I cooked his favorite meals. The times I wiped his tears without him asking. All of it still mattered. But the way it mattered had changed. I realized I could not undo what had begun. I could not return to the old days. Saad had grown into his new life. And I had to accept the space he needed. I allowed myself a single tear, sliding quietly down my cheek. It was not a cry of anger. Not a plea for attention. It was an acknowledgement of loss, of change, of a life moving forward without me at its center. From that moment, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not stop loving my son. But I would begin learning how to love from a distance. How to protect my heart while giving him the freedom he sought. The turning point had arrived, not as a storm, but as a quiet shift, a subtle, unshakable reordering of everything I had known. And in that shift, I found the first seed of acceptance. It was small, fragile, but it was there. Sometimes love requires patience. Sometimes it requires letting go without leaving. And sometimes it demands that we grieve the closeness that once was, while still holding on to hope for the future. The days after that turning point were quiet. Too quiet. The house felt like it had been rewritten while I slept. The laughter that once filled its corners had softened into polite murmurs. Even the clatter of dishes seemed different, measured, distant, almost foreign. At first, I tried to hold on. I visited more often, hoping for the old comfort, the familiar warmth. I called at odd times, imagining that my voice would remind him of the mother he once knew. I sent small gifts, hand-knit scarves, homemade sweets, notes tucked into his bag. But each time, I felt the distance. Saad no longer lingered. Sana's smiles were polite, careful, and always brief. I began to notice my words fading in the air before they could be heard. I began to feel like a shadow in my own home. One afternoon, as I sat alone on my balcony, watching the soft sunlight touch the plants I had grown for years, I realized something important. The love I carried for my son had not diminished. but my place in his life had changed. I remembered all the times he had been small, clinging to me, trusting me completely. The times I stayed awake through fevers, wiped tears in the dark, and whispered prayers over him while he slept. Those memories were not lost. They lived inside me, quiet and eternal. And now, I needed to learn how to let that love exist in a new form. Point one that did not demand recognition. Point one that did not cling. Point one that was patient and calm, even when my heart ached. I started small. I began giving him space without resentment. I stopped asking for details about his day unless he shared them willingly. I stopped planning meals or outings with him in mind. Instead, I focused on myself, on the parts of life that I had set aside while raising him. It was not easy. Every step forward required swallowing a small ache. Every smile I gave them without expectation was a quiet battle with my own loneliness. But slowly, something changed. I found joy in watching him live his life, even if it was without me at the center. I began to notice the subtle ways he still cared. A phone call just to ask if I had eaten, a message that said, "Mom, hope you're doing well." These small gestures became my new lifeline. I also found moments of connection with Sanaa. It was never the closeness I had once imagined. It was not warmth as familiar as a mother's embrace. But it was mutual respect, a soft recognition that we were all part of a shared life, even if our roles had shifted. There were quiet afternoons when we cooked together. She asked about my favorite spices. She listened when I shared stories of Saad's childhood. And slowly, I realized that she was not my enemy. She was a part of my son's life, someone I could choose to include rather than resist. Acceptance did not come in a day. It came in moments. Small, almost imperceptible moments of noticing. A smiled, shared memory, a thank you. Even the occasional hug that was not hurried or distracted. I also began to care for myself. That I read books I had long ignored. I took walks in the evening when the air was soft and stilled. I wrote letters to my son, letters I never sent, as a way of speaking my heart without expectation. These letters were not confessions nor complaints. They were a quiet acknowledgement that my love for him was steady, patient, and enduring. Over time, I understood a truth that had been hidden in the ache. A mother's love does not shrink when a child moves away. It transforms. It learns to exist across distance, across boundaries, across change. I began to notice the lightness that came with this realization. I could enjoy his successes without envy. I could witness his new life without sadness. I could celebrate his marriage, his choices, and the family he was creating. And in that celebration, I discovered my own freedom. One evening, as I sat quietly by the window, the soft orange glow of sunset filling the room, I understood that resolution was not about regaining the past. It was about finding peace in the present, about loving without control, about trusting without expectation, about letting go, gently, while holding on inside my heart. Saad came home that night. He noticed my quiet presence and smiled. I returned the smile. No words were necessary. Our eyes spoke 1,000 unspoken things: love, understanding, patience, and the acknowledgement of distance. I realized then that the heart does not break completely when a child moves away. It simply stretches. It learns a new rhythm, a new beat. And sometimes it discovers beauty in that space. I had been slowly pushed out. But in letting go of the closeness I had once known, I found a different kind of closeness. One built on respect, patience, and unwavering love. And in that quiet acceptance, I discovered a truth I had almost forgotten. A mother's heart is never empty. It only learns new ways to hold the ones it loves. In the days that followed, I learned how silence can teach you things words never could. When Saad did not call, I no longer filled the quiet with worry. I let it be. Not because I stopped missing him, but because I stopped punishing myself for it. I realized that I had spent many months trying to hold on to a version of motherhood that no longer existed. I was reaching for a past that had already walked ahead without me. And that struggle was what exhausted my heart the most. One afternoon, while dusting an old shelf, I found a small notebook Saad had used as a child. Inside were uneven letters and crooked drawings. On one page he had written, "My mom is the best." I sat down on the floor and held that notebook against my chest. I did not cry. Not this time. Instead, I smiled softly. Because that love had been real. It had not disappeared. It had simply grown into something quieter. That night, I prayed differently. Not for Saad to come back to me, but for peace to settle between us. I asked Allah to soften my expectations, Not my love Datio protect my heart without closing it. Slowly something shifted. Sana began to speak to me more freely. Not warmly. Not coldly. Just honestly. One evening she said, "Mom, I know things changed after marriage. I hope you don't feel pushed aside." Her words surprised me. I looked at her carefully before replying. "I felt it," I said gently. "But I am learning to stand again." She nodded, as if she understood more than she wanted to admit. That moment did not fix everything. But it opened a small window where walls had once stood. I stopped measuring love by visits and calls. I stopped counting days. I stopped waiting. Instead, I began living. I visited an old friend I had not seen in years. I started walking in the park every morning. I laughed more freely, even when no one was around to hear it. And in doing so, I realized something important. A mother's worth does not end when her child grows. It changes shape. I was no longer the center of Saad's world. But I was still part of it. And that had to be enough. One evening, Saad sat beside me while I folded laundry. "Mom," he said quietly, "you've been different lately." I did not ask what he meant that I already knew. "I am learning," I replied, "to let you live your life." He stayed silent for a moment. "I never wanted you to feel alone," he said. I looked at him and smiled softly. "Then don't disappear," I said. "Just don't forget." He nodded. And for the first time in a long while that was enough. Resolution did not come as a grand apology. It came as understanding, as acceptance, the ability to breathe again without pain tightening my chest. I still missed the closeness we once had. But I no longer felt erased. I had learned how to love without holding too tightly. And how to stand without leaning on my child. That was my healing. Not loud. Not perfect. But real. After everything that happened, my life did not suddenly become peaceful. Healing did not arrive like sunlight breaking through clouds. It came slowly. Quietly. Almost unnoticed. Some days I still woke up with heaviness in my chest. The kind of heaviness that sits there without asking permission. The kind that reminds you of what once was. But I stopped fighting it. I learned that pain becomes sharper when you resist it. And softer when you let it breathe. I began my mornings differently. Instead of reaching for my phone, I reached for myself. I made tea and sat in silence. Not waiting, just sitting. In that silence I started hearing my own thoughts again. Not the worried ones. Not the blaming ones. But the honest ones. I realized how much of my identity had been built around being needed. Around being the center of someone else's world. And when that center shifted, I felt lost. But that did not mean I was empty. One afternoon, while folding clothes, I caught myself humming an old song. It surprised me. Because it meant joy had not left me. It had only been hiding. I smiled to myself and let the song continue. That was the day I understood something important. I had given so much love to others that I forgot to give some back to myself. So I began doing small things. Not to impress anyone. Not to prove anything, just for me. I planted flowers on the balcony. I rearranged the furniture. I cooked meals I liked, even if no one else was eating with me. These were not acts of loneliness. They were acts of reclaiming myself. Saad noticed before he said anything. "Mom, you seem lighter," he said one evening. I looked at him and smiled gently. "I stopped carrying what wasn't mine anymore," I replied. He did not ask what I meant. And I did not explain. Some truths do not need words. Our conversations changed after that. They became shorter but more honest. There were no expectations hidden between the lines. I no longer asked questions that came from fear. I asked only what came from love. "How are you feeling? Are you tired? Did you eat?" And when he answered briefly, I accepted it. Not as rejection, but as adulthood. I also began seeing Sana differently. Not as the woman who took my place, but as the woman trying to build her own. One evening we stood together in the kitchen, quietly washing dishes. The silence was not heavy. It was thoughtful. "Mom," she said softly, "marriage changed him, but it changed me too." I looked at her then. Really looked at her. I saw nervousness. pressure, responsibility. She was not my enemy, she was learning just like I was. I know, I said gently. We are all learning. That moment did not turn us into close companions. But it removed a wall. And sometimes that is enough. I stopped measuring love by attention, I stopped comparing the past to the present, I stopped expecting life to return what it had already transformed. Instead, I accepted something deeper. Children do not leave us to hurt us. They leave us to become themselves. And mothers are not meant to follow forever, we are meant to release. That truth was painful, but freeing. I no longer waited at the door when Saad went out, I no longer felt invisible when plans were made without me, I no longer took silence personally. Because silence was not absence, it was simply space. I learned how to fill that space with dignity, with self-respect, with patience, with quiet pride. There were nights when I still cried. Healing does not erase emotion, it only changes how you carry it. But even my tears became gentler. They came without bitterness. They left without guilt. I forgave Saad in my heart. Not because he asked, but because I needed peace. I forgave Sana too. Not because she was perfect, but because she was human. And slowly I forgave myself. For loving deeply. For expecting closeness. For believing motherhood would last in the same shape forever. I learned that letting go does not mean loving less, it means loving wisely. Now, when I sit by the window in the evening, the light feels softer. Not because life became easy, but because I became stronger. I no longer feel pushed out, that I feel repositioned. From the center to the foundation. And foundations do not demand attention. They simply hold everything up. Now, when I look back, I see my story more clearly. Not as a tale of rejection, but as a journey of change. I used to believe that motherhood meant staying needed forever. That love was measured by closeness, by presence, by how often my son turned to me. But life taught me something gentler and harder at the same time. Love does not disappear when it steps back. Sometimes it simply learns to stand at a distance. I sit by the same window every evening. The light still falls softly across the floor. The world outside still moves forward without waiting for me. But I no longer feel left behind. I have learned that pain does not always demand an answer. Sometimes, it only asks to be felt, and then released. Saad visits now, not as often as he once did. But when he does, I listen more than I speak. I do not remind him of what he used to be, I meet him where he is. Sana has found her place in his life, and slowly she is finding her place in mine too. Not as a daughter. Not as an enemy. But as someone who shares love for the same man. That understanding did not come easily. It arrived through silence, through tears swallowed, through nights where I questioned my own worth. But it came. I no longer knock on closed doors, that I wait for them to open. And when they do, I enter without carrying yesterday's pain inside me. There are still moments when loneliness visits me. It sits quietly beside me, especially on evenings when the house feels too large. But I have learned to greet it without fear. Because loneliness no longer defines me. I am still a mother. But I am also a woman who has learned how to let go without losing herself. If there is one truth I now hold close, it is this. Children do not leave because we failed them. They leave because they are growing. And growing often looks like distance to those who stay behind. I do not blame my son, that I do not resent my daughter-in-law, I do not punish myself for loving too much. I simply carry my love differently now. With softer hands. With fewer expectations. With more peace. I did not lose my son. I only learned how to love him from a little farther away. There are evenings now when Saad calls me without any reason at all. Not to ask for something. Not to solve a problem. Just to talk. Those calls are short. Sometimes only a few minutes. But they carry a warmth I no longer chase. I have learned that love does not need to be loud to be real. When he comes to visit, I no longer rush to fill the silence with stories from the past. I let the present breathe. We sit together, sometimes we talk, sometimes we don't. And I have discovered that shared silence can be its own kind of closeness. Sana sits with us too now. She listens more, I speak less. We are still finding our way. Not backward, but forward. I no longer wish for things to return to how they were. That wish once came from fear. Now I wish only for understanding. I have stopped telling myself stories that hurt me. Stories where I am forgotten. Stories where I am unwanted. Instead, I tell myself a kinder truth. I raised a son strong enough to choose his own life. And that strength came in part from my love. Some nights, the loneliness still visits me. It sits quietly in the corners of my heart. But it no longer stays long. Because I have filled my days with meaning again. I walk in the mornings, I laugh with old friends, I take care of my health. I have learned how to live not around my child, but beside my own life. And in doing so, I have become lighter. If there is one thing I want other mothers to understand, it is this. Loving your child deeply does not mean holding them tightly forever. It means trusting what you gave them will carry them forward. There is no shame in missing your child. There is no weakness in feeling left behind. But there is strength in choosing peace over pain. Today, when I look at Saad, I no longer see distance, that I see growth. And when I look at myself, I no longer see loss, that I see survival. I am still his mother. That will never change. As time passed, I began to understand something I had been afraid to face. My son did not leave me all at once. He did not walk away with anger or intention. He drifted. And drifting is harder to accept than leaving. Because drifting gives you hope. It makes you believe you can pull someone back with patience, with silence, with love. I lived in that hope for a long time. I waited, that I adjusted, that I told myself stories to survive the ache. But hope, when it is one-sided, can quietly break a heart. The truth is, marriage did not take my son away from me. Life asked him to grow. And growth often creates distance before it creates balance. I had to learn that my place in his life had changed. Not disappeared, but shifted. Once I was his world, now I am part of it. That change hurt more than I ever admitted out loud. There were moments when I questioned my worth. Moments when I wondered if I had given too much. Moments when I asked myself whether loving deeply was a mistake. But love is never a mistake. It is only misunderstood when its form changes. I stopped blaming myself for feeling pain. And I stopped blaming my son for living his life. That was the turning point inside me. I began to see motherhood differently. Not as a role that demands closeness forever, but as a gift that prepares someone to walk without you. I realized that I had done my job well. Too well, perhaps. And that realization brought peace. Now, when I think of Saad, I do not feel loss first, that I feel gratitude. Gratitude that I raised a man capable of love. Gratitude that he has a partner to walk beside him. Gratitude that my sacrifices became his strength. I also learned something about myself. I learned that my life does not end where my child's independence begins. That my days still carry meaning. That my laughter still matters. I found comfort in simple routines, in morning light, in evening prayers, in conversations that did not revolve around being needed. And slowly my heart grew lighter. Not empty, just lighter. If you are listening to this and carrying a similar pain, I want you to hear this gently. You are not alone. Your love was not wasted. Your tears were not weakness. Motherhood is not measured by how close your children stay. It is measured by how well they live. And sometimes, the hardest part of being a mother is learning when to step back. And when to stand still with grace. I no longer chase my son's attention. I no longer compete for space in his life. I simply remain. Present. Loving. Open. Because love that is quiet can still be powerful. Today, when Saad hugs me goodbye, I hold that moment without fear. I do not wonder when the next one will come, that I trust that it will. That trust is my peace. I have learned to love without expectations, to care without control, to forgive without being asked. And in doing so, I found myself again. I am still his mother. But I am also whole. And that is how my story rests now. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with understanding. Sometimes children grow away from us, so that we can grow back into ourselves. I have come to understand that life changes quietly, often without warning. After Saad's marriage, it was not a dramatic break that I experienced. It was subtle, like a slow tide pulling back, leaving me to face the emptiness that followed. First, I blamed myself. I wondered if I had loved too much, asked too little, or somehow failed him in ways I could not see. Those thoughts haunted me like shadows in the corners of my home. There were days I would sit by the window for hours, staring at the street outside, hoping he might appear. I imagined him smiling, calling my name, opening the door with warmth in his eyes. But often the door stayed closed. The silence was louder than any words, and it settled in my heart like a stone I could not lift. I would make small meals, place them carefully on the table, thinking he might come. But they would remain untouched, or worse, he would take them without a word, and retreat to his world. I realized that his life had grown around him, and I was becoming a part of the background. At first, it hurt so deeply that I could barely breathe. I would lie awake at night, replaying every memory. His first steps, his first day at school, his first words, trying to understand when the closeness I had taken for granted had started to fade. I had carried him for 9 months, nurtured him for 20+ years, and suddenly it seemed that his life no longer had room for me. But as the months passed, I began to see things differently. I understood that Saad was not rejecting me. He was finding his place in the new life he had chosen. His marriage was not a betrayal. It was growth, and growth by nature requires space. The realization was bitter at first, like swallowing something unfamiliar, but slowly it began to bring peace. I had raised him to stand on his own feet. Confident, loving, responsible. That strength was mine to cherish, even if it meant stepping back. I started filling my days differently. I walked in the mornings, tending to the garden, savoring the gentle sunlight on my face. I spoke with old friends, laughed softly at their stories, and learned to embrace quiet moments without sadness. I wrote letters to myself, recounting memories that made me smile rather than ache. I found joy in small routines, realizing that my life did not end where my son's independence began. When Saad visited, I no longer filled the gaps with words. I let the silence speak. Sometimes we would sit together without saying much, and that too became comforting. The distance remained, but it was no longer painful. It became a reminder that love can exist even when it is not immediate, even when it is quiet. And in those moments I felt the true meaning of motherhood. Giving without expecting, loving without possessing, accepting without complaint. Sanaa, too, changed gradually. The initial tension faded with time, replaced by a respectful acknowledgement of my presence. We never became best friends, but we learned to coexist, understanding that family is not only about closeness but also about space and patience. It was a lesson I had to learn for myself as much as for them. That letting go is sometimes the truest act of love. Some nights, when the house is silent and the world outside seems far away, I sit by the window and reflect. I think of the years we shared, the sacrifices I made, the lessons I taught him. I do not regret them. Every moment shaped him, every act of love mattered. And though I sometimes feel the ache of absence, I also feel pride, knowing that the boy I raised has become a man capable of love and kindness. I have learned that a mother's heart is resilient, can feel empty and still find fullness. It can be overlooked and still shine quietly. It can be distanced from those we love most and yet remain deeply rooted in their lives. My love for Saad has not diminished. It has transformed. I no longer chase him or seek constant reassurance. I wait patiently, knowing that love endures, even when it is tested by time and circumstance. There is a serenity in acceptance. I understand now that I cannot control every aspect of my son's life, and nor should I. The greatest gift I can give him and myself is the freedom to grow, alongside the quiet strength to remain a constant presence, even from afar. Our bond is no longer the loud, inseparable closeness of childhood. It is a deep, unspoken connection that exists in glances, in memories, in the simple knowledge that we are still family, even when life moves forward. And so, I have come to peace. I have learned that being pushed out does not mean being forgotten. It means learning to love differently. It means understanding that a mother's role evolves, and that the heart, though it aches, can expand in ways that bring unexpected strength and grace. Carry Sod in my heart always. I celebrate his life, his choices, and the woman he has chosen to walk beside him. And in that celebration I find joy again. If I could tell other mothers who might be feeling the same quiet pain, I would say this. Do not lose yourself in absence. Do not let the silence convince you of rejection. Your love is never wasted. Your presence, even when quiet, is a gift that shapes the lives of those you raised. Step back, breathe, live. And trust that the bond you forged with your children endures, even when it seems fragile. My story ends not with despair, but with a gentle, enduring truth. Love changes, lives change, and yet, the heart that loved first remains, resilient, steadfast, and quietly luminous. And so, I sit by the window, watching the soft evening light fall across the room, feeling a sense of calm I never imagined possible. My son may have moved forward into his life, and I may have been pushed slowly aside, but our bond, subtle and enduring, remains unbroken. I am his mother. That will never change. And I have learned to live fully in the love I still carry, quietly, patiently, and without fear.